Jared Kincaid felt like he'd been hit with a sledgehammer by the cacophonous crowd of aliens and the overpowering stench of sweat as he jostled his way through the crowded spaceport. His rugged face, marked by battle scars like a worn map, stood out amidst the chaos. The seasoned veteran had come to this remote part of the galaxy seeking peace, but instead found himself confronting a nauseating scene, a slave auction. His gnarled hands instinctively clenched into fists as he watched from the edge of the crowd. On a makeshift stage, beings of various species were herded like cattle, their fear palpable even from afar. Jared's instincts as a soldier screamed at him to intervene, but the weight of his years and the harsh reality of his situation kept him in place. He was just one man, old, worn, and alone, up against an entire system steeped in corruption and greed. The auctioneer, a rotund alien with an excess of eyes, bellowed for bids as the stage filled with the latest lot. Jared's gaze was drawn to a small group of 4 female aliens standing at the edge of the platform. Each one was unique, but they all shared a look of desperation. At the front was the tallest, with burnished copper skin and eyes flashing with defiance. Her muscular frame and proud stance told Jared she was a warrior. A harsh shove from a guard made her stumble. "Get in line, Zara," the guard spat, and Jared committed her name to memory. Next to Zara was a willowy figure with iridescent skin that shimmered with every movement. Her wide, liquid eyes darted around nervously. Jared realized this must be Gaia, one of the rare telepathic species. A smaller alien with feline-like features stood beside Gaia, her sharp teeth bared in a snarl. Her fierce independence radiated even in chains. "Thara," Jared overheard her name as she scanned the crowd, already calculating her escape. The last of the group stood apart, her plant-like appendages swaying gently despite the lack of breeze. Her pale green, translucent skin and faceted eyes took in the scene with unnerving calm. Kim, as the auctioneer announced her, seemed to observe quietly, analyzing the situation. Bidding began, and Jared felt a familiar ache in his chest. He thought of Sarah, his beloved wife, long gone. Sarah would never have stood by and watched such injustice. She always did what was right, no matter the cost. Jared sighed, feeling the weight of his loneliness pressed down harder than ever. He couldn't just walk away. 5,000 credits, Jared called out, his gravelly voice cutting through the din. The crowd fell silent, eyes turning toward the old human who dared to interrupt. The auctioneer blinked his 10 eyes before a greedy grin spread across his face. 5,000 credits from the human. "Do I hear 6? Prices quickly climbed as other buyers joined in, but Jared held firm, his heart racing with each bid. He hadn't expected to be here, doing this, but he couldn't back down now. The girls on stage watched him, hope mixed with suspicion in their gazes. 15,000, came a smooth, oily voice from the back of the crowd. Jared turned to see a tall, regal figure stepping forward, dressed in ornate robes that shimmered in the dim light. The crowd parted as he walked, giving Jared his first real look at the alien prince, Jorik. Jared clenched his fists. He couldn't let Jorik win. 20,000, Jared growled, digging deep into his savings. Jorik's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. For a moment, it seemed like he might raise the stakes, but then he simply stepped back. The crowd murmured in surprise. Jorik would not challenge the bid further. "Sold," the auctioneer barked, practically salivating as he addressed Jared. As Jared approached the stage, the weight of the crowd's stares settled heavily on his shoulders. The girls watched him cautiously as their shackles were removed. Jared, his heart still pounding, stepped closer. "You are free," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I offer you sanctuary if you wish it." The 4 women stood silently, processing his words. They were free now, no longer bound by the chains of the auction, yet none of them moved to leave. Zara's defiant gaze softened slightly. Gaia's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Despite everything they had endured, something about Jared's presence, his calmness, and sincerity made them feel safe, if only subconsciously. Each of them had learned to trust no one, but something about this human, scarred by his own battles, stirred a quiet sense of security they hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom was theirs, yet none of them chose to run. Instead, they found themselves drawn to follow him. Zara was the first to step forward, her fierce eyes locking onto his. "Why?" she demanded, her voice strong and sharp, filled with the weight of a lifetime of battle and suffering. "Why would you do this?" Jared let his gaze sweep over the four of them. Zara, Gaia, Thara, and Kim, each one battered by life, each one looking for something to trust. He thought of the ghosts that haunted him, the lonely homestead waiting for him in the distance, and the injustices that still plagued a galaxy he had fought so hard to protect. "Because it's the right thing to do," he answered simply. The tension lingered as they followed Jared to his small ship. Zara stayed close, her warrior instincts on high alert. Thara trailed behind, casting suspicious glances at Jared, her claws flexing as though expecting betrayal at any moment. Gaia moved tentatively, her large eyes welling with unshed tears, while Kim glided quietly, her plant-like appendages shifting to adapt to the ship's layout. Jared could feel the weight of their unspoken questions, but he knew words wouldn't ease their fears. Once aboard, Jared set a course for his home, a quiet human-colonized planet far from the lawless chaos of the galaxy's core. The stars streaked past the ship's viewports, the hum of the engines a gentle background to the uneasy silence inside. "I know you have no reason to trust me," Jared said, turning to face them. His voice, though gruff, held a gentleness that came from years of experience. "But I give you my word as a soldier and as a man. You're under my protection now. No harm will come to you." The girls exchanged glances. Jared sensed that Gaia was likely involved in their unspoken bond, linking their emotions. Finally, Zara stepped forward. "We accept your offer of sanctuary, Jared Kincaid," she said, her voice formal but wary. "But know this, we are not helpless. If you deceive us, we will defend ourselves." Jared smiled faintly, nodding. "I wouldn't expect anything less." As the ship hurtled through hyperspace, Jared retreated to the cockpit, leaving the girls to settle in. He stared out at the swirling lights of hyperspace, a heavy feeling in his chest. He had done the right thing, but a part of him knew this was only the beginning. He had stepped into something far larger than himself. The journey back to his homestead had begun, but so had something much more profound. As Jared plotted their course, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life and theirs were about to change in ways he never imagined. This wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something extraordinary. The lush landscape of Jared's homestead stretched out before them as the ship settled onto the grassy clearing. The contrast between the tranquil haven and the chaotic spaceport they had just left wasn't lost on the four alien women as they cautiously disembarked. Towering trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling in a calming rhythm, a world away from the harsh realities of their recent past. Jared led them toward his weather-worn house, nestled amid the greenery. The structure was sturdy though simple, showing the wear of years spent in quiet isolation. His eyes briefly lingered on a faded photograph of Sarah, his late wife, smiling from a shelf. Her warmth seemed to fill the room for a moment, tightening his chest with the familiar ache of loss. "It's not much," Jared said, his voice gruff but sincere. "But it's home. You're welcome to stay as long as you need." The women spread out cautiously, each exploring the unfamiliar space. Zara remained vigilant, her eyes scanning the room for threats. Gaia moved gracefully but hesitantly, picking up on the emotional residue of Jared's solitude, wincing slightly as she sensed more than he intended to reveal. Thara prowled around the perimeter, her predatory gaze taking in every corner, while Kim was drawn to the outdated technology scattered around the home, her faceted eyes gleaming with interest. The air was thick with unspoken tension, and Jared busied himself with preparing a meal, his movements mechanical, an attempt to process the sudden shift in his life. The women, still unsure of his true intentions, remained on edge. Zara was the first to break the silence. "Jared Kincaid," she said, her voice formal, I must speak with you about the debt of honor I now owe. Jared turned from the stove, confusion crossing his face. Debt? There's no debt here. I told you you're free. Zara shook her head and stepped closer. In my culture, a life saved is a life owed. By rescuing me, you have bound me to your service until the debt is repaid. Jared frowned. That's not how it works here, Zara. You don't owe me anything. The tension thickened as their voices rose, neither fully understanding the other's customs. Gaia, the empath, winced as the emotional conflict grew. Instinctively, she reached out with her abilities, washing the room with a sense of calm. Jared and Zara paused, the argument halting in the soothing wave. I'm sorry, Gaia whispered, embarrassed by her intervention. There's so much fear, so much uncertainty. Can't we try to understand each other? Jared's expression softened, and he nodded. You're right, Gaia. We've all got a lot to learn. The tension lifted, and as the evening wore on, they gathered around the table to eat. The unfamiliar food before them sparked conversation. Thara, ever the skeptic, poked at her meal suspiciously. How do we know this isn't some human trick? She growled, her tail twitching. For all we know, you could be fattening us up for something nefarious. Jared chuckled, the sound rough but genuine, as though he hadn't used it in a long time. If I had any nefarious plans, there are easier ways than cooking up a mediocre dinner. Thara narrowed her eyes, but couldn't quite suppress a flicker of amusement. Fair point, old man. But I'm watching you. As they ate, Kim's gaze kept drifting toward the outdated systems around the house. Her curiosity eventually got the better of her. Your technology is quite primitive, she observed. If you'd allow me, I could make improvements to your home's efficiency. Jared blinked, caught off guard by the offer. That's kind of you, Kim, but you don't have to do anything to stay here. Kim tilted her head, her plant-like appendages swaying. It's not about earning my keep. It's about contributing. That's what a home is, isn't it? Everyone has a role. Her words struck a chord with Jared. It had been so long since his home had felt alive, since there had been anyone to share it with. He swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. Yeah, I suppose it is. As the evening wore on, the question of sleeping arrangements arose. Jared insisted the women take the bedrooms while he made do with the couch. But as he lay on the lumpy cushions, staring at the ceiling, sleep eluded him. The house, once silent, was now filled with the sounds of life. He could hear Thara pacing restlessly, her natural instincts still on edge. Gaia's soft murmurs carried through the walls, likely her way of processing the emotional overload of the day. Kim quietly tinkered with some equipment, undeterred even at night, and Zara, ever the protector, stood by the window, scanning the horizon. Jared's thoughts drifted back to Sarah. What would she have thought of all this? He could almost hear her laughter, see her smile at the strange family he had gathered. For the first time in years, the ache of her absence was softened by something new, something like hope. A soft sound broke through his thoughts, and he opened his eyes to find Zara standing over him, her presence both guarded and comforting. You should rest, Jared Kincaid, she said quietly, her voice softer than before. I will keep watch. Zara, you don't have to, he said, but she interrupted him, her voice tinged with vulnerability. Let me do this. It's comforting to have a purpose. Jared nodded, understanding the need to feel useful all too well. All right then. As he drifted off to sleep, a warmth spread through him, not just from Zara's protective presence, but from the realization that his lonely homestead was slowly becoming a home again. Morning dawned quietly, sunlight filtering through the windows as Jared moved about preparing breakfast. He found himself surrounded by curious aliens, each adapting in their own way. Kim had already begun interfacing with the house's systems. I've optimized your power grid, she said with quiet pride. Efficiency is up by 37.2%. Jared smiled at her enthusiasm. Thank you, Kim. The conversation at breakfast flowed more easily than the night before. The walls between them were coming down, trust starting to build. But with familiarity came new challenges. Jared stood at the sink, washing dishes in his usual methodical way. He'd always found the mundane task oddly calming, but today calm was the last thing on his mind. Zara, the ever-fearless warrior, had stationed herself right next to him, way too close. Her concept of personal space seemed more of a suggestion than a rule, and Jared could feel the warmth of her body as she stood inches away, watching him with sharp eyes. "Need a hand?" she asked, her voice low but firm. No, I've got it," Jared mumbled, trying to focus on scrubbing a stubborn plate. He could feel the heat rising in his cheeks as Zara leaned in, her muscular arm brushing against his. "Well, I don't know how you humans do it, but you're scrubbing that pan like it owes you money," Zara remarked, her breath brushing against his neck. Jared nearly dropped the plate, clearing his throat as his hands trembled slightly. Just thorough." The proximity stirred up feelings he hadn't felt in years, feelings he thought he'd buried with Sarah. It was disorienting to say the least. As if sensing his inner turmoil, Gaia appeared. Her empathic powers, already tuned into the emotional tension, guided her as she placed a delicate hand on Jared's arm. Her fingers were cool against his skin. "You're anxious," Gaia said softly, her voice like a gentle breeze. "Let me help." The moment her touch connected with his arm, Jared felt a sudden surge of warmth, but not the calming kind. It was confusing. What was supposed to be a comforting gesture somehow sent a wave of jittery excitement coursing through him. "I'm fine," Jared stammered, pulling his arm back gently, though the sensation lingered longer than it should have. Zara raised an eyebrow, glancing between Jared and Gaia with a smirk. "Looks like you're doing fine, all right." Before Jared could respond, Thara padded into the room, her feline grace practically oozing confidence until she hesitated. She had always been the strong, independent one, but today she seemed unsure. Her tail flicked nervously as she approached Jared. "Jared," she started, her voice softer than usual, "I could use some advice about freedom." Jared turned, grateful for the distraction, but as Thara leaned in, her hand brushed against his shoulder, and her face came much closer than he expected. Her sharp features and piercing eyes stared into his, and he suddenly felt the air grow heavy with unspoken tension. It wasn't intentional, at least he didn't think it was, but her closeness only added to the growing sense of discomfort and bewilderment. "Sure," Jared coughed, trying not to notice how close her lips were to his face. What advice?" Thara, perhaps unaware of the awkward proximity, blinked and leaned even closer to listen. Jared could almost feel the tickle of her breath on his cheek. A sudden tension gripped his chest. Finally, Kim entered the scene, as cool and logical as ever. But even she managed to accidentally turn things up a notch. "I've made adjustments to the power grid," she announced proudly, striding toward him with a datapad in hand. "But I could use your assistance with the final calibration." "Yeah, sure," Jared said, eager for a distraction. He practically leaped at the opportunity to escape the ongoing parade of confusing emotions. Together, he and Kim worked side by side on the system upgrades. They were shoulder to shoulder, close enough that their hands brushed occasionally as they adjusted various panels and wires. Each time their fingers touched, Jared felt a strange flutter in his chest, something halfway between admiration and attraction. Though Kim, ever the focused one, didn't seem to notice. The morning sun filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow over Jared's homestead. The usual quiet of the house was now punctuated by the presence of his new companions, each exploring and adapting to their new environment in their own way. Jared found himself caught between the comforting normalcy of his old life and the chaotic excitement of integrating four new, extraordinary beings into it. Zara, always the warrior, had set up a perimeter around the property, her vigilance a constant reminder of the dangers they had left behind. Her presence was reassuring in its own way, a fierce protector in a world that had suddenly become more complicated. Jared often found her scanning the horizon, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Gaia, the empathic telepath, had taken to helping around the house with an unexpected enthusiasm. Her ability to sense the emotional undercurrents in the room made her an invaluable asset, particularly in diffusing the occasional tension that flared up. She'd started organizing the homestead's clutter with a gentle touch, her large eyes sparkling with a mixture of curiosity and empathy as she moved through the spaces. Thara, with her feline grace, was adjusting to the new surroundings with a mix of skepticism and intrigue. She had taken to prowling the grounds, her movements more of a watchful reconnaissance than an exploration. Her keen senses and occasional growls when she encountered something unfamiliar were constant reminders of her warrior spirit. Kim, on the other hand, had immersed herself in updating the homestead's technology. Her fascination with the outdated systems was evident in the way she meticulously worked on each component. Jared had found her tinkering with everything from the old comm system to the rusty water pump, her eyes glowing with the thrill of revitalizing something old into something new. By mid-afternoon, Jared had managed to slip into a routine that, while different, was beginning to feel oddly comfortable. The new schedule was an odd blend of old habits and new adjustments, but Jared was finding a rhythm. The quiet hum of the ship's engines as he ventured out to check on the fields was a familiar comfort. Yet, it was strange to see Thara, with her sharp eyes and feline agility, assisting him. Her cautious demeanor shifted to focused assistance as she helped him with the farming tasks, her claws deftly pulling weeds from the soil. "I have to admit," Thara said, her tone grudgingly appreciative as she worked beside Jared, "this soil is more forgiving than I expected. The technology in your home might be outdated, but your farming methods aren't half bad." Jared chuckled, wiping sweat from his brow. "Thanks. I've had a lot of practice. You get used to it." His voice was light, but there was a hint of melancholy as he spoke. He missed the simplicity of working the land alone, but the presence of his new companions was a strange comfort. Meanwhile, inside the house, Kim had transformed the old, cluttered workspace into a hub of efficiency. Her latest project involved updating the power distribution system, and her concentration was so intense that she barely noticed when Jared entered. "Jared," Kim said without looking up, her voice carrying the calm precision of someone completely engrossed in their work. "I've completed the recalibration. The energy output should be stable for the foreseeable future. However, I've noticed that your communication array could benefit from a complete overhaul." Jared leaned over her shoulder, his gaze following the intricate adjustments she was making. "I appreciate the help, Kim. I didn't realize how outdated everything was until you showed up." Kim's eyes flicked up to meet his for a brief moment. "It's what I do best, and I enjoy it. This house, your home, has a certain charm. It's been a long time since I've worked on something so hands-on." As the evening approached, the homestead seemed to settle into a new rhythm. Gaia, sensing the collective shift in mood, had begun preparing dinner with a gentle grace that brought a certain calm to the space. Her telepathic abilities made her sensitive to the needs and emotions of those around her, allowing her to cook with a quiet ease that contrasted sharply with the more tense interactions of the day. At dinner, the table was set with a variety of dishes, a mix of alien and human foods. The women had contributed their own culinary skills, adding a colorful array of new flavors to Jared's simple fare. The conversation flowed more freely than it had in days, each person finding their place in the shared experience of breaking bread. As they ate, Zara's stern demeanor softened. She glanced around the table, her warrior's eyes observing her companions with a newfound sense of respect. "You know," she said, her voice carrying a rare note of warmth, "I've fought many battles, but this feels different. It's not just about survival anymore." Jared nodded, understanding her sentiment. "It's not. It's about finding something more, something worth fighting for." The night continued with an easy camaraderie that was slowly taking root among them. Each person had begun to open up, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for the future. Jared found himself listening more than speaking, absorbing the tales of his companions as they wove their experiences into the fabric of his life. Eventually, the evening wound down, and Jared found himself sitting on the porch, the stars twinkling overhead. The homestead, once a solitary retreat, now felt alive with the presence of the 4 women he had rescued. It was a strange, wonderful feeling, like finding a new purpose amid the remnants of a past he could never fully escape. As he looked up at the stars, Jared felt a quiet sense of optimism. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and mysteries yet to be unveiled. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope, a belief that perhaps this unexpected journey was leading him towards something greater than he had ever imagined. In the distance, he could see the faint silhouettes of his companions, each finding their own place in this new chapter of their lives. They were more than just refugees from a harsh world. They were becoming a part of his world, each one contributing to the ever-evolving tapestry of his life. The stars above seemed to twinkle in response, as if acknowledging the promise of new beginnings. And for Jared, it was the beginning of a journey that would test his resolve, his values, and his heart. But it was also the start of something profoundly meaningful, something that would redefine his understanding of family, home, and purpose. As the night deepened, Jared allowed himself to dream, to imagine a future where hope and redemption intertwined, creating a new legacy for the once lonely homestead. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, he faced it with a renewed sense of hope and possibility.